Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 486. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's show. We got a lot to talk about today. The war in Ukraine, some news about China, and then a little bit on the situation in Niger as that evolves. So please share. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's get into the news today. First story up here, I wrote for the Institute, published this morning. Prosecution unable to locate key evidence in Teixeira's case. Judge orders alleged Discord leaker to remain in jail. So a federal judge in Massachusetts denied Massachusetts Airman Jack Teixeira's motion to be released while he awaits his trial to begin. Teixeira is accused of leaking classified documents on Discord that undermine the narrative put forward by the U.S. government that the war in Ukraine was going well. The judge explained that authorities have been unable to find Teixeira's hard drive, cell phone, or any of the documents he is accused of leaking. In April, highly classified documents began circulating online showing war plans, Western troop deployments in Ukraine, casualty estimates, and a bleak prognosis for Kiev's war efforts. Other documents were embarrassing to Washington, such as revelations that the White House spied on UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres or South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. Initially, mainstream outlets speculated the documents were released by the Kremlin as pro-Russian propaganda. However, the New York Times outed Teixeira as the leaker, and he was subsequently arrested. The government has indicted Teixeira with 6 violations of the Espionage Act. Each charge carries a 10-year maximum sentence. The airman has pleaded not guilty to the charges. Last week, Teixeira and his legal team appeared in court before Judge Indra Talwani and were hoping the 21-year-old would be released into the custody of his father as he waits for his trial to begin. Talwani denied Teixeira's request while noting there were factors that she said weigh in the favor of release. However, the judge says she sided with the prosecution that Teixeira posed a risk of obstructing justice if he was released. And then this is what she wrote in her decision. The circumstances of the offense leave open the possibility for further harm because some of the classified information at issue has not yet been recovered. The government has not found any of the physical documents Teixeira allegedly printed, nor has it located a hard drive from Teixeira's home computer or digital copies of documents Teixeira may have stored electronically and then posted online. In the wrong hands, the information and documents that the government has not recovered could do great harm to the community by threatening national security. And I think this is a good time to point out that there is this crazy thing going on where I believe the Washington Post and the New York Times both have far more of Teixeira's documents than they've actually published. And so essentially working on behalf of the U.S. government, the FBI, to make sure the American people are deprived information that they, should have, as we'll get into why some of the information Teixeira leaked is so important in a minute here, or is alleged to have leaked. I would say that, this information, so in one sense, I guess somebody could be like, oh, if they can't find his hard drive, well, in cell phone, well, that means, he likely knew that he had been outed and destroyed them before, the government was able to find them. 100% possible that is the case. It's also possible that they can't find it because maybe he's not the person. And so I think it's worth considering that this guy has pleaded not guilty. He was outed by the mainstream media, not the law enforcement. And it seems that they haven't been able to cover a lot of key evidence. So this is interesting. I'm not sure what evidence the government actually does have against Teixeira, as obviously his trial isn't underway yet. The judge also raised issue with comments Teixeira made online and his interest in firearms. She said Teixeira's social media messages display both an affinity for violence and vitriol for certain classes of people. And I'm pretty sure that would just be like an elite class, the Washington politicians and stuff like that. The airman's lawyers say the posts were made primarily among teenagers on a forum dedicated to war and combat-based video games. And so, look, they're saying that more or less they're saying that this is typical gamer behavior, what he was saying. And I was a high schooler and I played a lot of Call of Duty, and I could tell you that people say some pretty ridiculous things when they're playing games like Call of Duty. And so if he's playing one of these war-based games and him and his friends are just BSing with each other and saying the most ridiculous things they can, well, that is kind of just a part of how young males act. And so it seems rather ridiculous to keep him in jail, especially as his legal team also pointed out that other alleged leakers, not ones like Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning, do get pretrial release. Or Julian Assange, I need to clarify, there is not a leaker. He is a leaky. He is a journalist. So, Chelsea Manning would be the example of somebody who leaked information, doesn't get released. But people like Trump, who was it? Not Petraeus, the former CIA director who gave documents to his mistress. These people are allowed to still walk around freely, where actual leakers who provide crucial information to the American people do not get that. So just to wrap up here, one of the documents Teixeira is alleged to have released shows the U.S. intelligence community believe Ukraine would fall well short of its goals to retake territory. Type White House officials such as Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the assessment was incorrect, and the Joe Biden administration pushed Ukraine to launch the counteroffensive in early June. As the leak intelligence assessment predicted, Ukraine has only made small gains on the battlefield, and Washington demanded Kiev employed tactics that involved taking high casualties in the counteroffensive. And so, if we look back at the documents that Teixeira released, it's pretty clear that Washington sent tens of thousands of Ukrainian men to their death for a couple meters of territory. It's absolutely absurd and disgusting. And so that's why I think it's so important to continue to talk about this case, but also point out that there seems to be maybe some issues with what the government's doing here. All right. Next up here, Australian lawmakers to visit Washington to lobby for Julian Assange's freedom. And this is really important. I was on the Misty Winston show. That was Tuesday, September 5th. And so that should be out on Spotify in the next few hours here. So head on over and check that out. But in Misty's intro, she basically just reads this article by Dave DeCamp that does a really good job of covering the story. And Misty really says that this is something that's very important, and something that, as activists that are pro Assange, it's important to, tweet at people like Rashid Tlaib and other members of Congress who are supposed to be in support of whistleblowers and journalists like Julian Assange. So Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, others, and say, hey, you should really do everything you can to welcome this Australian delegation and highlight what they're doing in the United States. So Dave writes here, a delegation of Australian lawmakers will visit Washington later this month to lobby for the freedom of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. 6 members of the Australian Parliament from across the political spectrum will make the trip, including the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, and she said, we span the political spectrum, we span the hard left to the hard right. Besides the weather and Julian Assange, we probably don't agree on anything. And he added that both Labour and the coalition think that this matter has gone on far enough. What's to be gained by this going any further? If the Justice Department is seeking a sense of retribution, it's already been achieved by the amount of time Julian Assange has been in jail. And it's crazy that they're, just admitting that their allies in the United States are seeking retribution against Julian Assange for information that he published, for following the First Amendment. There's really no disagreement with this. Outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, they publish classified documents. They taught American officials who give them top classified information all the time, and nobody from the Post or Washington or Times ever goes to jail. Why? Because they don't release information that the U.S. government really doesn't want released, like Julian Assange does. So the delegation's visit is set for September 20th and 21st, and plans to meet with both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. The idea is to draw attention to the issue before Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's scheduled trip to the United States at the end of October. The Australian government has stepped up pressure on the U.S. in recent months to drop the case against Assange, who has been held without charges in London's Belmarsh prison, as the U.S. has been planning to extradite him. And so I will say, like, if Australia, I think, really, really wanted to, they could tell the U.S. that, look, if you want us to be a part of your anti-China alliance through like the AUKUS Pact and all these other things, you want us to continue moving forward with this, then you will move forward and release our citizen, Julian Assange. But obviously they're not willing to apply that kind of pressure, at least not so far. All right, let's move on and talk about the war in Ukraine. Big story here from Dave DeCamp. Eastern European NATO countries fear peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. NATO members that border Russia and Belarus are afraid that growing opposition to the proxy war in Ukraine inside the United States will put pressure on Ukrainians to pursue peace talks with the Russian state. While the Biden administration's stated policy is to back Ukraine for as long as it takes, and the majority of Congress still supports the proxy war, there is growing fatigue among Americans. A recent poll from CNN found that 55% of Americans are against Congress authorizing more spending on the conflict. President Trump, the former President Trump, and that's the Republican frontrunner for 2024, has claimed he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. And so this is, good rhetoric. I don't want to say that I think Trump will actually do this, but it's interesting that this is what he's, one of the main things that he's really running on is that Biden has put the world in a very dangerous situation in Ukraine, and that he will, be the one to negotiate and unwind it. So the Biden administration is seeking to sign a long-term security deal with Ukraine to tie the hands of a future administration on the issue, but the political climate has some NATO members nervous that peace might be pursued. The report said that Poland and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have looked at talking with Putin as a red line. Those four nations want the U.S. and the rest of Ukraine's Western backers to prepare for a future where the Russian leader is completely isolated. The narrative from these countries on NATO's, what they call the Eastern flank, is that peace talks would reward Putin and put Russia in a better position to exert its influence. And this is what an unnamed Baltic official told The Hill. All of this then increases the threat on NATO's border. Putin would be able to sell negotiations as a victory, and it would help him exert even greater political influence globally. We already see it in Africa, in Niger, and in South Africa. It is not a military threat, but a diplomatic one too. And so this is just absurd that these countries do not want Russia to have any ties with any other countries, which is never going to happen. If you actually look at what the proxy war in Ukraine has done, it has driven more countries, including countries that were at one point in time pretty solidly within the Western orbit. Think of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, into Brits, into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, into other deals with Russia. So I think this is all really important. And of course, I think, it's just an important reminder that there are a lot of people in the West who do not want this war to end. Despite what they say that this is all about the Ukrainians, that we just need to save Ukrainian lives. They really don't care about that. They want this war to keep going to weaken Russia. All right. Next up here, Bucharest denies Ukraine's claim that Russian drone hit Romania. So NATO member Romania has strongly denied that Ukrainian claim that a Russian drone detonated in Romanian territory during an overnight bombardment on one of Ukraine's ports on the Danube River. Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesperson made the claim on Facebook. He said that according to Ukraine's State Border Service, a Russian drone fell and detonated on the territory of Romania during an attack on a Ukrainian port that is along the river that separates Romania from Ukraine. And so this, I think, is important that Romania came out and denied it so quickly. They really didn't want to turn this into a bigger issue. And for anybody who's watching the show, you could kind of see where the port that was being attacked is, and then where Romanian territory and Ukrainian territory is, and just, I guess, how easy it would be, especially with electronic warfare systems, for a Ukrainian drone, a Russian drone that is a part of the war, to end up in another country like Romania. However, I think the bigger issue here isn't necessarily that we should look at that and say, oh, in the future this might happen, but we should say Ukraine is again trying to draw NATO into a war with Russia. We saw this before when I believe it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that landed in Poland and killed 2 people, although it could be another country. The Ukrainian government instantly blamed this on Russia, and this actually upset the White House a little bit. It's not often that any of Ukraine's Western backers get a little miffed with Kiev, but they did at that issue because, they were lying and telling lies that were going to potentially provoke a direct war between NATO and Russia, and this is again happening. So it'll be interesting to see what the NATO response is, what the White House response is in the days to come. All right, another false accusation against Russia, although this one was made by the U.S. South Africa says inquiry found no evidence of arms shipped to Russia. On Sunday, the South African president said an independent inquiry found no evidence that a Russian cargo ship that docked in South Africa last year was loaded with weapons despite U.S. claims. The Russian ship, Lady R, docked at a naval base near Cape Town in December 22, angering the U.S. because the vessel was under U.S. sanctions. Without evidence, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Breedtree, claimed in May that the ship was loaded with weapons, saying he would bet his life on the assertion. I don't know if that legally means that somebody can murder him now, but it does seem that he lost a bet that he placed his life on. So, kind of interesting there. This is what the South African president said, and the inquiry was led by a retired judge. The panel found no evidence that any cargo ship of weapons was loaded for export on the ship, Lady R. None of the persons who made these allegations could provide any evidence to support their claim made against our country. And so, you had this idea that Russia is going to be the country that ends up isolated, but if you go around the world making these baseless accusations, it's going to push these countries further into the orbit. And Russia and South Africa have, some pretty strong ties as BRICS members, and we've seen a lot of coordination and cooperations within the BRICS agreement to add new member states. So I wonder, if South Africa feels closer to the BRICS coalition after being slammed with this false accusation by the U.S. So the U.S. Embassy in South Africa responded to the report put out by the president, saying, "We will let South Africa speak for its panel's conclusions." It kind of sounds like they're trying to say they don't believe it, but they don't have any way to really refute it either. So that's where it's going to stand. All right, next up here, article by Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. Watchdog, cluster bomb deaths in Ukraine are the highest in the world. As the proxy war in Ukraine continues raging, people are being killed and wounded by cluster bombs at a higher rate than anywhere else in the world, including Syria, according to the Cluster Munitions Coalition. The coalition, which is a network of NGOs that support banning the controversial weapon, released an annual report showing 2022 was the deadliest year on record globally for cluster bomb-related killings. Cluster bombs open up in the air and scatter scores of small bomblets and submunitions across large target areas, then often kill non-combatants for decades prior to the conclusion of conflicts where the arms are used. More than 120 countries have signed on to the United Nations Convention prohibiting the munitions which indiscriminately kill. However, Washington, Kiev, and Moscow are not signatories. Both Kiev and Moscow have been firing the weapons during the war. In July, the U.S. announced it would be providing Ukrainian forces with cluster bombs, even though evidence already existed that Kiev has used the munitions to kill civilians before the Kremlin launched the invasion. Alex Hinkler, an independent expert with the Forum on Arms Trade, complained that he and other researchers are baffled by the fact that Washington is sending totally outdated weapons that the majority of the world has banned because they disproportionately kill civilians. Over 300 people were killed and in excess of 600 were wounded by these bombs in Ukraine last year, per the coalition's report. Syria, which until recently was the site of the most yearly cluster bomb casualties, saw 15 people killed and 75 wounded. In Iraq, where the U.S. military has used cluster bombs during the Iraq War and the 2003 invasion, 15 people were killed and 25 people were wounded. In Yemen, where Riyadh used U.S.-provided cluster bombs to kill civilians during the genocidal war against northern Yemen's Houthis, there reports 5 deaths and 90 people wounded by the bomblets last year. In 2022, there were no cluster bomb attacks reported either in Iraq or Yemen. And so, that gives a very primary example of this is a country where cluster bombs were used by the U.S. or U.S. allies, and then even after those cluster bombs were, ceased being used for a whole year, they're still killing people. So this is why we shouldn't have sent them to Ukraine in the first place. All right, another story here by Connor Freeman. Ukraine defense minister resigns amid military graft and corruption scandals. Amidst a deluge of corruption scandals, particularly with regards to military graft, Ukraine's defense minister Reznikov resigned on Monday. Prime Minister Zelensky announced he will be replaced a day earlier. This comes as some U.S. lawmakers have cited graft as a reason to impose limits on military and financial aid to Kiev for its war with Moscow. Zelensky has come under pressure from the West to ensure Ukrainian officials were not siphoning off some of the billions of dollars in aid that were flowing into Kiev, the New York Times reported. Last week, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with the heads of the Special Investigation Agency, a prosecutorial office, and a court. The meetings involved discussions about crackdowns against wartime corruption. Last month, following allegations that some members were taking bribes from men seeking to avoid conscription, Zelensky fired the heads of all regional military recruitment offices. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry is currently subject to a widening investigation and mired in scandals. At one point this year, about $980 million in weapons contracts had missed their delivery dates, according to government figures, and some payments for weapons had vanished into overseas accounts of weapons dealers, according to reports made to Parliament. Though precise details have not emerged, the irregularities suggest the procurement officials in the ministry did not vet suppliers or allow weapons dealers to walk off with money without delivering the armaments. It stressed that the report from Ukraine stressed that it stressed in the Times report that such revelations are not yet touching on foreign military or financial aid, while it is acknowledged that military spending accounts for nearly half of Ukraine's national budget, and reports of contradicting scandals to shift in the source of public corruption. And so, this is something that we know has been going on. The Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe prior to the invasion. I'm sure it's only gotten worse during wartime, and the only people who don't seem to want to recognize it are the members of Congress and the White House, who continue to shovel massive amounts of billions of taxpayer dollars into Ukraine. All right, last story on the war in Ukraine here. Putin tells Erdogan Russia will rejoin grain deal if sanctions are eased. And so I love how this is presented in Western media. Putin issues list of demands to return to grain deal, when what Putin is saying is that the way the original grain deal was negotiated, there were certain sanctions on Russia that were, I guess, either supposed to be lifted or ignored in order to allow Russia to ship some of its agricultural products through the Black Sea. And that simply has not happened. And so That is essentially what Putin is arguing, is that if the one of Putin's main demands is the revival. For the revival of the deal is reconnecting the Russian agricultural bank to the SWIFT payment system. A few days before the Putin-Erdogan meeting, the Turkish news agency reported that the UN proposed reconnecting the bank to SWIFT and unfreezing the assets of Russian companies producing fertilizers in Europe. And so, even the UN is saying that these steps should be taken, and it's the Europe and Washington that is refusing. And so while everybody in the West, and particularly in the mainstream media, is condemning Putin for causing starving, what we're really seeing is because of the Western sanctions. All right, I believe this is the last of my articles I have to talk about today, but I do have a couple more. A report: Russia, China, and North Korea to hold trilateral war games. South Korea's intelligence service believes Russia, China, and North Korea are preparing to conduct joint military drills. Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang have all frequently complained about American war games near their borders. According to South Korean legislator Yu, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu likely proposed that North Korean soldiers join Russian and Chinese troops for military exercises during a July meeting with Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. Yu says he learned the information during a closed-door discussion with South Korea's National Intelligence Service. The report comes as Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang have become increasingly frustrated with Washington and its allies conducting war games near their borders. Last week, the U.S. and South Korean forces wrapped up annual joint military exercises, which included sending American strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. In response to the drills, Kim ordered his forces to conduct a test of their nuclear capabilities. In the South China Sea, Washington contests Beijing's territorial claims by sending warships into Chinese waters and claiming the deployment is a freedom of navigation operation. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin explained NATO war games in Ukrainian territory were viewed as intense provocations by Moscow. On Saturday, the Kremlin envoy to Pyongyang explained that North Korea's participation in joint exercises with China and Russia was an appropriate response to the, and this is a quote, constant bilateral and trilateral exercises being held by the U.S. and its junior partners in Asia. And then right after I wrote this story, the Russian Defense Ministry came out and confirmed Moscow was planning to conduct joint military drills with Pyongyang. Additionally, the Russian Defense Minister said Kim was planning to travel to Russia for an upcoming meeting with Putin. And so, as I predicted on this show, as I've been saying time and time again, if you try to exile all these different countries from the world, they're all just going to get together and, develop stronger ties. So, kind of appropriate to go along with that, we have this story here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. Philippines conduct joint naval patrol in the South China Sea. The U.S. and the Philippines navies conducted a joint patrol in the disputed South China Sea on Monday, a step that increases the chance of a dangerous encounter between the U.S. and Chinese vessels. The U.S. Navy's Japan-based 7th Fleet said that the guided missile destroyer, the USS Ralph Johnson, joined the Philippines guided missile frigate, the BRP Jose Rizal, for the bilateral sail. During the sail, the ships completed division tactics, which are at-sea training designed to help ship handlers practice maneuvering with close proximity to other vessels and improve the confidence of the teams to manage the challenging sailing conditions. And so they're carrying out naval operations with the Philippines in Chinese claimed waters. Of course, this is going to be seen as very provocative to Beijing. All right, we're going to wrap up here with a quick update on Niger. France holding talks to withdraw of certain military elements from Niger. A French source told AFP on Tuesday that France is holding talks with Niger's post-coup government on the withdrawal of certain military elements from the West African country. France has about 1,500 troops in Niger and has strongly backed threats from the Economic Community of West African States, that's ECOWAS, to intervene in Niger to reinstate the former president who was ousted by a coup on July 26. France has also refused to withdraw its ambassador from Niger despite demands from the junta led by General Tashimni, but reports but the report of talks between the post-coup government and France signals tensions could be easing, as Al Jazeera also reported that discussions were on a partial French withdrawal. On Monday, Niger's military-appointed prime minister said Niger was hoping to reach a deal with ECOWAS to avoid a war. And so let's see how this plays out. I'm guess not super confident at this point that we are going to be able to avoid a military conflict in West Africa. It seems like the West, particularly France, is really interested in pushing and trying to, I think, reset the government there, but we'll see how it plays out. Anyways, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning into the show. Back with more shows later in the week. And just as a heads up, my coworker at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, is taking a couple days off. I mean, Dave does an incredible amount of work at antiwar.com as the news editor. I'm going to do my best to fill in for him. So just be aware, I'm probably going to be writing a lot more articles over the next couple of days. And then the show on Thursday might be a little late or something like that, or on Friday. So just be aware that if I am a little bit behind on anything this week, I am working as the news editor at antiwar.com covering for Dave. So I will be fairly busy, and huge congrats to my coworker Dave, who not only is an amazing writer, but a great father and is expanding his family once more. So anyways, shout out to Dave, and everybody, thank you so much.